You said the right thing at exactly the wrong moment. You watched the room contract, just slightly, just enough, and you didn't understand why until 3 days later, when the understanding arrived at 2 a.m., with the particular clarity of things that can't be unseen. The meeting had gone well, technically. You had the numbers, you had the argument, you were correct, and the person across the table, less prepared, less informed, less right, walked out with the result you came in to get. This isn't a rare situation. It isn't a story about bad luck or a particularly unfair environment. Ask anyone who has spent enough time in organizations, in relationships, in any structure, where human beings want things that other human beings control, and they'll tell you a version of the same story. The most competent person in the room doesn't always win. Sometimes they lose with a consistency that begins to look like a pattern, and the pattern points not to a problem with their competence, but with something they never learned to see. What follows is a forensic examination of that something, not a system for gaming people, not a blueprint for becoming someone you're not. A way of seeing that, once acquired, makes the invisible visible, the currents beneath the surface of every conversation you've had and every one you'll have. But before we go further, there's something you should know. Understanding how power moves between people doesn't resolve the central tension. It intensifies it. The question you'll end up with isn't how to win. It's whether winning, in the way the game is typically played, still means what you thought it did, based on the book The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene, and adapted into narrative format to make its ideas practical and engaging. Chapter 1. The Invisible Game. Why the room you walked into already had rules you were never shown. You were never taught how power works. That wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a conspiracy. It was something quieter and more pervasive than either. A collective agreement, mostly unspoken, to treat power as a subject unfit for polite instruction. Think about every classroom you sat in, every mentor who shaped your thinking, every piece of advice from someone who cared about you and wanted good things for your life. What did they hand you? Work hard. Be honest. Treat people the way you want to be treated. Show up, do good work, and good work will speak for itself. These weren't lies. That's what makes them complicated. The problem isn't that the values you were given were wrong. The problem is that they were incomplete. And the gap between what you were taught and how the world actually runs has been costing you, quietly, for longer than you've tracked it. The evidence doesn't announce itself in dramatic moments of injustice. It arrives in accumulations. A promotion that went to someone with less to show, a relationship that shifted when you couldn't identify the fault line, a negotiation you walked out of feeling like you'd lost before it started, a room where you said all the right things and still left with less than you arrived with. You analyzed those situations. You replayed them. You tried to find what you did wrong. And you came up mostly empty, what you didn't consider, what almost no one considers, because the thought itself is disorienting, is that what you did wasn't wrong. It was legible. Someone else in that room was reading you, and you didn't know the language was being spoken. There is a specific kind of loneliness in that. The loneliness of losing a game you didn't know was being played. Every room you walk into has an architecture of power that exists before you arrive and will persist long after you leave. Part of it is formal, titles, org charts, the designated decision-maker whose name appears on the meeting invitation. But the formal architecture is almost always the least significant part. The real architecture is invisible, and it runs beneath the surface of every professional relationship, every family dynamic, every social arrangement humans have ever constructed. The real architecture is about information. Who holds it? Who controls its flow? Who has access to the things that people in positions of formal authority actually need? Access, attention, loyalty, intelligence about what's happening before the official briefing. The person with the formal title isn't always the person the most of those things. And the person with the most of those things isn't always the most visible. Think about the environments you've spent the most time in. Your workplace. Now ask, who in that organization actually knows what's happening before it's announced? Who's read of a situation when they give it turns out to be accurate in ways the official version isn't? Whose opinion, when shared quietly, shifts what other people do next? That person is exercising real power. Their formal title may or may not reflect it. What they have isn't authority. It's something more durable than authority, and considerably harder to take away. Most people, when they enter a new environment, focused their attention almost entirely on the formal architecture. They read the reporting lines, identify the official gatekeepers, figure out who they need to impress according to the organizational chart. This isn't a mistake, exactly. It just misses the more important map, the one that shows where trust actually lives, where fear sits, where alliances are genuine and where they're circumstantial, who is listened to and who is merely heard. Reading that map is harder because no one posts it anywhere. It has to be inferred from behavior over time, from who talks to whom before the meeting starts, from which names get invoked when real decisions get made, from the quality of attention people pay when certain voices speak. Reading it requires you to set down the script of your own performance long enough to observe the performance happening around you. There's a difference between being seen and being known. Most people in most professional environments invest enormous energy in being seen, in making sure the right people notice their contributions, their presence, their potential. Far fewer invest equally in knowing, in genuinely understanding the people and dynamics around them. The distinction matters because real information about others is one of the most durable forms of leverage available in any environment. Not information to weaponize, information to understand. To know what someone is afraid of is to know where they'll retreat. To know what someone wants is to know what they'll move toward. To know what someone values is to know what earns their genuine trust versus their performed approval. Robert Greene spent years in Hollywood before writing the 48 Laws of Power. Years observing the mechanics of the entertainment industry with a transparency that most industries paper over with more respectable language. He watched careers made and destroyed not primarily by talent but by positioning, by relationship management, by timing, by an understanding of who needed what from whom and when. He watched intelligent, capable people fail because they couldn't read a room. He watched mediocre people succeed because they understood something structural about how influence moves through hierarchical systems. The 48 laws he extracted from those observations, and from thousands of years of historical precedent, from Machiavelli to Sun Tzu, to the biographies of everyone from Louis XIV to P.T. Barnum, aren't a set of tactics. They're a taxonomy, a systematic naming of the behavioral patterns that determine outcomes in competitive human environments. The value isn't in applying them mechanically, like a recipe. The value is in having the vocabulary, because once you can name a pattern, you can see it. And once you can see it, you can respond to it deliberately rather than reactively. Take Law 1. Never outshine the master. On the surface, this sounds like advice to be strategically mediocre, to dim yourself down in the presence of people with authority over you. That's a misreading. What the law actually describes is a psychological dynamic operating in every hierarchical relationship. The person above you in a hierarchy, however secure they appear, carries a fear of being replaced. It's often unconscious. They may genuinely like you. They may want you to succeed. But there is a threshold past which, in their nervous system, you shift from asset to threat, and this shift happens before they're consciously aware of it. If you've ever noticed someone who seemed genuinely supportive of you suddenly becoming less available, less generous, less warm, without any obvious cause, you may have crossed that threshold. Not because you did anything wrong, because you became something their psychology registers differently. The long-term consequence of not understanding this dynamic isn't just that you get passed over once or lose one negotiation. It's that over time you develop a pattern. You become the most talented person in the room who somehow never gets the room, and you interpret this as a system that fails to recognize merit. The system does fail to recognize merit. That's accurate. What's less clear is that understanding precisely why it fails, in mechanical terms, gives you more options than simply performing better and hoping the recognition follows. One of the unusual qualities of Greene's method is that he treats history not as a record of events, but as a laboratory of human behavior. The courts of Renaissance Florence, the maneuvering of Cardinal Richelieu, the strategic communications of Queen Elizabeth I, the ascent of Henry Kissinger. He reads them all as case studies in applied psychology. The actors change, the technology changes, the moral frameworks people use to justify their behavior change, but the underlying dynamics, the fear of displacement, the hunger for recognition, the complex interplay of loyalty and self-interest, remain remarkably constant. This constancy is the crucial insight. You might look at a case from 16th century Florence and think, that was a different world, with different stakes, different norms, different brutalities. True, but the minister who navigated the Medici court by never taking a position more visible than his patrons. He was doing something that a department head in a modern organization does every Tuesday. The context differs. The psychology doesn't. This is what makes historical study useful beyond curiosity. It gives you a sample size that no modern individual can accumulate through direct experience. Across 1,000 years of documented human behavior, you start to see not the accidents but the structure. You see what holds constant when everything else changes, and what holds constant turns out to be human nature, which is, conveniently, the thing surrounding you in every environment you'll ever enter. Here's the inversion that usually catches people off guard. The laws don't describe what powerful people do differently from everyone else. They describe what all people do, powerful, powerless, and everyone in between. The person successfully applying Law 7, get others to do the work for you, but always take the credit, isn't operating according to some secret moral calculus that most people would reject. They're following an instinct shared by virtually every human being who has ever benefited from someone else's labor without full attribution. The difference is that they're doing it with intention and structure. Everyone has done some version of this. Few have examined why it works. There's a particular kind of discomfort that arrives when you start looking at power with real attention. It isn't the discomfort of encountering something alien. It's the discomfort of recognizing something you already knew but had been careful not to know too clearly. The belief that good work speaks for itself. The belief that sincerity is its own strategy. The belief that if you focus on doing your job with excellence and treat people decently, the political dynamics will sort themselves out around you. These beliefs aren't entirely false. In genuinely functional environments with unusual levels of psychological safety, they hold much of the time. But most environments aren't that. Most are complex human systems where multiple agendas operate simultaneously, where the stated goal and the actual goal are often different, where formal and informal processes coexist and sometimes directly contradict each other. You know this. At some level of awareness that sits below your articulated beliefs, you've always known this. The discomfort of reading Greene isn't the discomfort of learning something new. It's the discomfort of having something named that you've been careful to leave unnamed. Because naming it seemed to carry obligations you weren't sure you wanted. If you name the game, you have to decide whether you are playing it. If you're playing it, you have to decide how. If you're deciding how, you have to confront what you're willing to do and what you're not. And that confrontation, with the real geography of your own values and their limits, is more demanding than simply not looking. So here's a question that deserves a real answer. What has your preference for not seeing cost you? Not in the abstract. In your actual life, in the specific rooms you've been in, with the specific people who have moved through your professional and personal world. What outcomes look different in retrospect if you apply the possibility that someone understood the dynamics more clearly than you did? You don't need to arrive at a complete inventory right now. But stay with the question long enough to let it become uncomfortable. The discomfort is informational. The most useful frame for understanding what Greene is mapping isn't morality, it's ecology. Power, in the environments Greene studies, operates the way resources operate in natural systems. It flows toward the organisms best adapted to capture it, regardless of whether those organisms are the ones we'd most want to see succeed. The lion and the tick are both successful organisms. Their success says nothing about their moral worth. This isn't an argument for amorality. It's an argument for intellectual honesty about what you're observing. When you watch someone rise in an organization through strategic relationship management, careful information control, and an almost instinctive understanding of what other people need from them. And that person isn't particularly talented, isn't particularly ethical, and isn't the person you'd have chosen. You can tell yourself a story about the corruption of the system. That story might be partially true. But if it prevents you from understanding the mechanism, it costs you more than the comfort it provides. The mechanism, once understood, can be engaged with consciously. You don't have to become the tick, but you might consider what the tick understands about the ecosystem that you've been deciding not to understand. And what a more accurate map of that ecosystem would make available to you. Think about the person in your professional life who has always seemed to land on their feet, who moves through organizations with a social buoyancy you've found difficult to fully explain, Who gets more latitude than their results strictly warrant? Who seems to know things before they're announced? Who ends up in the conversations that matter without having formally earned the right to be there? You probably have someone specific in mind. You've had feelings about this person that were difficult to categorize. Not quite resentment, not quite admiration, something more ambivalent than either. Part of what this narrative will give you is a vocabulary for what you've been watching. Vocabulary changes the quality of seeing. The 48 Laws of Power has appeared on the New York Times bestseller list multiple times. It's reportedly one of the most requested books in American prisons. A fact that says something interesting about who needs to understand power dynamics most urgently, and why. It has been read by politicians, athletes, executives, and artists, by people who want to use it offensively, and people who want to use it defensively, by people fascinated by it and people disturbed by it who want to understand exactly what disturbs them. What all those readers share is a recognition that they have been living inside a set of dynamics they didn't fully understand. The specific nature of what each wants to do with that understanding varies widely. But the recognition itself is the same. This narrative is for people somewhere inside that recognition. Not beginners who have never thought about power, and not operators who have been consciously deploying these laws for years. It's for people who have an intuition that the world runs on mechanisms they haven't fully mapped, who have felt the effects of those mechanisms without being able to name them, and who are ready to look at the map. What you're learning isn't how to dominate. You're learning how to see. The seeing itself changes the dynamic, because the moment you understand that you've been inside a game, you begin to play it with consciousness rather than instinct. And consciousness, the ability to observe your own behavior and its effects in real time, to make deliberate choices rather than reactive ones, is itself a form of power, probably the most durable form there is. There are two ways to prepare for any situation involving other people. The first is to prepare your performance, what you'll say, how you'll present yourself, what you want them to know about you and your work and your thinking. Most people do this. They rehearse the pitch. They anticipate the questions. They work on projecting the kind of confidence or warmth or competence the situation seems to require. The second is to prepare your perception, to think, before you walk into a room, about who is in it, what they want, what they're afraid of, what would make them feel respected, and what would make them feel threatened, how the dynamics between them operate, what the room actually needs from the encounter. This is rarer. It requires turning attention outward rather than inward, prioritizing understanding the system over performing within it. People who do the second kind of preparation consistently make better decisions in the moment, not because they're smarter or more technically prepared, but because they're operating with a more accurate model of reality. They know where the doors are. That turns out to be useful when the building starts moving. There's a difference between reading a room and performing in it. Reading requires stillness, an internal quiet that allows you to receive information from the environment rather than broadcasting into it. Performing requires energy directed outward. Both are necessary. The problem is that most people have the ratio badly inverted. They spend 90% of their energy performing and 10% observing, when the proportions that would serve them are closer to the reverse. The best performers in any high-stakes human environment, the negotiators, the therapists, the leaders who seem to understand what a room needs before the room knows, are almost universally, at their core, extraordinary observers. Greene's central argument, though he never states it quite this plainly, is that every organized group of human beings is, in some meaningful sense, a court, not in the theatrical sense of kings and queens, but in the functional sense of a hierarchical arrangement of people who want things from each other and who manage the distance between what they want and what they reveal. Every workplace is a court. Every family, in its way, is a court. Every friendship group that has existed long enough to develop its own internal politics is a court. The court has certain invariant features regardless of its formal structure. It has insiders and outsiders. It has people who are trusted and people who are merely tolerated. It has informal coalitions that form around shared interests and dissolve when those interests diverge. It has information that circulates through official channels and information that circulates through informal ones. And the informal channel is almost always faster, richer, and more reliable. It has people who understand they're in a court. And people who would be offended by the comparison, the people offended by the comparison are, on average, less effective navigators of it. This is not a coincidence. The laws that Greene extracted from history are the informal rule book of the court. The behavioral patterns that the most effective navigators have always understood intuitively, and that the least effective have always violated without knowing they were violating anything. They're not a moral code. They're an observation. They describe what works in the specific sense of what produces the outcome where you keep your position, maintain your relationships, and move toward the things you want, without unnecessarily producing enemies who have the power to complicate your life, understanding that code doesn't require endorsing it. Plenty of people have read it with dismay, found it cynical, wanted it to be less accurate than it is. The dismay is a reasonable response. The code is, in many ways, not a flattering portrait of human nature, but an unflattering portrait is still more useful than a flattering one that doesn't resemble the subject. Consider what it meant, historically, to be illiterate in a world built on written language. Not stupid, not incapable, simply operating without access to an entire layer of information that the world was producing continuously. Decisions that seemed irrational from the outside made perfect sense from within that information gap. Outcomes that seemed arbitrary had structure that only the literate could see. Power blindness works the same way. It's not a character flaw, it's an information gap. And information gaps, once identified, can be closed. The analogy extends further than it might first appear. A literate person in a world of illiteracy doesn't automatically become powerful. Literacy is a tool, not a guarantee. What it provides is access to information, to communication, to the accumulated reasoning of everyone who ever wrote anything down. What you do with that access depends on your judgment, your values, and your willingness to act on what you understand. Power literacy works the same way. Understanding the laws removes a specific blindness. What you see with the vision you recover is still entirely up to you. There's also a question worth asking early. What kind of power do you actually want? The 48 laws, read without care, can appear to point in a single direction, toward dominance, toward control, toward the accumulation of influence at other people's expense. That reading is available. It's also the least interesting one. The more precise reading is that the laws describe the available range of human behavior in power-laden environments. Understanding that range lets you choose your position within it, rather than simply occupying whatever position circumstances assign you by default. Some people encounter these laws and decide to deploy them aggressively. Some encounter them and focus on defense, on recognizing when the laws are being used against them and knowing how to respond. Some develop a quieter, more durable form of influence, one that doesn't require constant maneuvering because it's built on something harder to erode than tactics. Reputation, genuine utility to the people around them, and the particular authority that comes from being consistently right about things that matter. All three paths are available to you. Only the third requires the map to navigate well. The closing of this particular gap is what this narrative is about. Not the accumulation of tactics, not the development of a cynical worldview, not the transformation of your personality into something harder and less recognizable. The closing of an information gap that has been shaping your outcomes without your knowledge or consent, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in ways that have altered the trajectory of years. What you learn here will not make every room easier. In some ways it will make certain rooms harder, because you'll see things you previously had the comfort of not seeing. You'll recognize dynamics that you previously attributed to coincidence or personality. You'll understand, with a clarity that sometimes feels inconvenient, exactly what someone is doing and why. And you'll have to decide in real time what that understanding obligates you to do. That obligation is part of the deal. You can't take the map without also taking responsibility for where it shows you the territory actually is. That map won't flatten the territory. Real environments are messier than any framework can fully contain, and the people in them are more contradictory, more surprising, and more capable of genuine decency than a purely strategic lens would suggest. What the map does is add a layer of legibility to what was previously noise. Some of the noise will turn out to be signal. Some of what felt personal will turn out to be structural. Some of what seemed like bad luck will turn out to be pattern. And patterns, unlike luck, respond to deliberate behavior. The first thing this chapter asks of you is simple, and harder than it sounds. Revisit some of the rooms you've already been in, the real ones, the ones where something happened that you still don't fully understand. The negotiation that tilted before you knew it was tilting. The relationship that changed without an identifiable moment of change. The opportunity that went to someone else for reasons that didn't add up to anything you could call fair. Don't analyze them yet. Don't assign blame or build a case or decide who was right. Just look at them again, this time with the beginning of a new vocabulary. Ask what the architecture of power was in that room, who held information others didn't, who understood what others wanted without being told, where the real game was being played beneath the stated one. You'll find that more comes into focus than you expected. Not because the world is darker than you thought, but because it has more structure than you were shown. And structure, once visible, is workable. The walls that felt like weather turn out to be walls, fixed, mappable, navigable once you can see them for what they are. What comes next is the map, Chapter 2, the architecture of influence, how power actually moves, and why most people mistake the current for the water. The reason you were given rarely matches the reason something happened. This isn't always a lie. Sometimes it is, but more often it's a gap. The space between the explanation someone can give and the actual chain of causation that produced the outcome. Most professional decisions, most organizational shifts, most moments where someone rises or falls get explained through a narrative that makes the result sound more rational, more meritocratic, and more inevitable than it actually was. You've been on the receiving end of these explanations, the feedback that tells you something about your work, but nothing about the political context that made the decision inevitable before the work was even reviewed, the restructuring rationale that cites business strategy, but has nothing to say about the two people who had been trying to remove each other for 3 years, the promotion rationale that describes the person who got it in terms that would apply to you equally well, possibly more so. The explanation is never wrong, exactly. It just doesn't account for the actual mechanism. Understanding the actual mechanism is what this chapter is about. Every organization runs 2 operating systems simultaneously. The first is the official one, the stated mission, the formal processes, the criteria articulated in job descriptions and performance reviews and strategic plans. The second is the actual one, the informal network of relationships, obligations, fears, and interests that determines what really gets decided, by whom and why. Most organizations put enormous resources into maintaining the first operating system. The second maintains itself. The official operating system is what you were trained to navigate. You learned its logic in school, in your first jobs, in every context where someone with authority over you gave you criteria for success. Criteria that were real to a degree. Criteria that also obscured as much as they revealed. Because the official criteria, competence, productivity, measurable output, don't account for the variable that most consistently determines outcomes in human systems. How much other people want you to succeed. How much other people want you to succeed is not a soft or vague metric. It runs downstream of very specific things, whether they trust you, whether they feel invested in your success, whether your success would reflect well on them or threaten something they value, whether you've given them reasons to root for you or reasons to prefer that you don't rise any further. These aren't psychological add-ons to the professional system. They are the professional system. The rest is scaffolding. There's a difference between being competent and being indispensable. Competence is a threshold quality. You need enough of it to be taken seriously, but past a certain point, more of it produces diminishing returns in terms of how others respond to you. Indispensability is a relationship quality. It comes from making yourself necessary to the specific people who have power over your outcomes. Being the person they come to when something is difficult, the person they trust with information they don't share broadly, the person whose absence would create a problem they'd rather not face. Competence can make you indispensable, but it rarely does on its own. Power in organized human environments runs on 3 currencies, not money, though money can purchase all 3. Information, reputation, proximity. These 3 things, in varying combinations, account for nearly every durable form of influence you'll observe in any environment you inhabit. Understanding how they work, and more importantly how they interact, is the architecture this chapter is mapping. Information is the most obvious of the 3, and probably the most misunderstood. The value of information isn't symmetrical. What matters isn't just what you know, it's what you know that others don't, who knows that you know it, and whether what you know about other people's situations gives you something to offer or something to withhold. The information that produces leverage is specific. Who is worried about what someone needs that they haven't publicly acknowledged needing, what is about to happen before it's announced. Access to this kind of information is rarely accidental. It's the product of relationships cultivated with people who sit at the intersection of multiple information streams. Reputation is more durable than information and more powerful in the long run because reputation operates even when you're not in the room. It's the story people tell about you when you can't control the narrative. Law 5 in Greene's taxonomy is blunt about this. So much depends on reputation that you must guard it with your life. The phrase sounds hyperbolic until you watch what happens when someone's reputation shifts. How quickly the interpretive frame around their behavior changes. How actions that were previously attributed to confidence start getting attributed to arrogance. How the same decision that would have earned respect from someone with a strong reputation earns skepticism from someone whose reputation is uncertain or damaged. The long-term consequence of not managing your reputation is that someone else manages it for you. This isn't always malicious. Often it's simply the natural result of other people filling the information vacuum you've left. When you're not visible in a room, someone else's characterization of you operates in your place. That characterization reflects that person's interests, their relationship with the people they're talking to, and their read of what the audience wants to hear. It rarely resembles the characterization you would give of yourself. Most people discover this too late. When the reputation they didn't know they had starts producing outcomes they can't explain, proximity is the subtlest of the three currencies, and the one most people underinvest in. Proximity means physical, conversational, and relational closeness to the people who make decisions that affect your outcomes. It's the difference between being known to someone and being known by them, between being a name they recognize and being a person they think about when something relevant arises. The research on proximity and decision-making is consistent. People systematically overestimate the quality and relevance of what's close to them. This isn't a flaw in reasoning that smart people overcome. It's a feature of human cognition that operates at every level of intelligence and professional sophistication. The three currencies don't operate independently. They compound. Information without reputation means you know things no one will ask you about. Reputation without proximity means your standing is known, but can't be converted into influence in the specific rooms where decisions happen. Proximity without reputation means you're close to power, but regarded as incidental to it. The combination that produces the most durable influence is all three in alignment. You're known to have good judgment. You're physically and relationally close to the people who matter, and you hold information that makes you useful in specific, non-redundant ways. Any single currency can create temporary influence. The three in compound create something more structural. Law 6 in Greene's taxonomy adds another dimension to the concealment principle. Court attention by creating an air of mystery. The psychology behind it is straightforward, even if the execution is subtle. Human attention is a finite resource, and it flows toward what it can't fully explain. A person who reveals themselves completely gives the people around them no reason to keep paying attention. The picture is finished. A person who reveals just enough to establish credibility while retaining a quality of unknowability continues to generate attention, speculation, and the kind of interest that keeps them present in conversations they're not physically part of. Mystery isn't about being withholding for its own sake. It's about understanding that incompleteness is a form of invitation. Selective disclosure bridges the concealment principle and the information currency. The information you share matters less than when you share it, with whom, and what you withhold in the same exchange. The person who shares everything knows signals that they have no filter between what they know and what they say, which signals, in turn, that they either have nothing worth protecting or lack the judgment to protect it. The person who shares the right information with the right people at the right moment signals something more valuable, that they have access to more than they're offering, that they choose their disclosures deliberately, and that being close to them means being close to a well that runs deeper than the bucket they're currently handing you. Law 3 in Greene's framework instructs you to conceal your intentions. This is one of the laws most likely to produce discomfort on first reading, because it sounds like advice to be systematically deceptive, to go through your professional life wearing a mask. That's not what the law describes. What it describes is something more nuanced and considerably more psychologically interesting. When you reveal your intentions early, you give people the opportunity to form their response before you've had the chance to demonstrate the value of what you're proposing. They evaluate the idea in the abstract, filtered through their existing assumptions, their current priorities, their existing commitments, and their feelings about you. When you hold your intentions, operating toward your goal through means that don't immediately signal the goal. You give people the opportunity to experience the value of what you're doing before they've decided whether they approve of it. Think about how this plays out in a specific context. You have an idea for changing how something works in your organization. You could announce the idea with a proposal and a rationale, and watch it get evaluated immediately against everyone's existing preferences and resistance to change. Or you could start doing the thing, implementing small parts of it, demonstrating the value in concrete terms, building the coalition of people who benefit from it before the idea has a name and becomes something that can be opposed. By the time the idea is formally named, it also has a track record. That's a different conversation. Here's the inversion. The most transparent communication of your intentions is often the least effective way to get what you want. Not because people are fundamentally opposed to your goals, but because humans respond to evidence differently than they respond to proposals. A proposal asks them to imagine an outcome. Evidence shows them one. The part of the brain that evaluates imagined outcomes is far more skeptical, far more vulnerable to competing narratives, and far more susceptible to loss aversion than the part of the brain that recognizes something already working. Concealing your intentions isn't about deception. It's about sequencing your evidence correctly. Reputation works like infrastructure in the sense that it's most visible when it fails. When your infrastructure is solid, when the roads work, when the power stays on, you can move through your environment without thinking about what's holding everything up. When it fails, it becomes the only thing you can think about. Reputation operates the same way. A strong reputation is something you don't have to defend, explain, or compensate for in every interaction. It precedes you into rooms, softens the interpretation of your ambiguous actions, and creates the benefit of the doubt that allows you to take risks without immediate punishment for failure. A damaged reputation does the opposite. It follows you into rooms and makes your neutral actions suspect, your confident actions arrogant, your ambition threatening. And the cruel mechanics of reputation damage is that the behaviors most likely to repair it, transparency, admission of error, consistent good work over time, are exactly the behaviors that reputation damage makes harder to execute because you're executing them under conditions of scrutiny and skepticism that would test anyone's consistency. Greene's historical examples on reputation are instructive across centuries. He examines figures who built images so robust that they survived events that would have destroyed less carefully constructed reputations. Queen Elizabeth I understood, with unusual precision for her era, that the story told about her was as important as anything she actually did. She managed that story with the same attention she gave diplomatic negotiations. The result was a reputation that functioned as a political instrument. One that communicated strength without confrontation, projected stability during periods of genuine instability, and maintained authority in circumstances that would have undermined a less carefully constructed image. What does your reputation actually say about you? Not what you intend it to say, not what a careful reading of your actual work and values would produce, but what the story circulating about you in your environment currently says. These are often different things, and the gap between them is where a great deal of professional misfortune lives. You can approximate an answer by paying attention to which of your actions people find surprising. Surprise indicates a gap between what someone expected from you and what you did. The pattern of people's surprises is a reasonably accurate map of the reputation you have versus the one you thought you had. The same move, made at different moments, produces entirely different outcomes. This is one of the most underappreciated structural realities in competitive human environments. Most people understand timing intuitively in the sense that they have a vague sense of when something feels too soon or too late. Fewer understand it as something you can get significantly better at through sustained attention to how moments work, Law 35 in Greene's framework addresses this. Master the art of timing. What the law is really about is reading the readiness of a situation. Every decision-making environment has a readiness cycle, a period during which a new idea or move can't get traction because the context isn't prepared for it, followed by a window during which the same idea or move is received well, followed by a period during which it arrives too late and feels like a reaction rather than a choice. The skill isn't in having the right idea. It's in holding the right idea until the situation is prepared to receive it. Timing is also relevant in smaller-grained ways that don't involve grand strategy. The timing of when you speak in a meeting, the timing of when you follow up after an initial conversation, the timing of when you push and when you wait in a negotiation, the timing of when you share information and when you hold it. In each of these micro-situations, the same action at slightly different moments produces measurably different responses. Most people don't optimize for this because they're focused on the content of what they're doing, not the moment they're doing it in. The moment, it turns out, is also content. There's a difference between patience and passivity. Passivity is waiting without a goal, without reading the situation, without preparing, so that when the moment arrives, you're positioned to move. Patience is active waiting, holding a position while remaining alert, reading the shifts in your environment, doing the preparatory work that makes decisive action possible when the conditions align. Most people, when told to be patient, practice passivity. They wait and do nothing and call it strategy. The person who uses the waiting period to build reputation, deepen relationships, accumulate information, and prepare their position isn't being patient in the conventional sense. They're loading a spring. There is a consistent and well-documented gap between what people say influences them and what actually does. Ask someone why they trust another person, and they'll give you reasons centered on competence, track record, and shared values. Watch how trust actually forms in real time, and you'll see something more immediate and less rational. A sense of being understood, a feeling that the other person sees them, the subtle relief of being in the presence of someone who doesn't need anything from you in a way that creates pressure. Law 43 in Greene's framework. Work on the hearts and minds of others. The framing is deliberate. Hearts before minds. Not because the emotional is more important than the rational, but because the emotional is the gateway through which the rational is received. Present someone with a compelling logical argument while they feel defensive or threatened, and the logic will be processed through the filter of that emotional state, which means it won't land the way you intend. Present the same argument after you've made someone feel seen, respected, and genuinely considered, and the same logic will find almost no resistance. This isn't manipulation in any pejorative sense. It's sequencing. The problem is that most people, in professional environments especially, were trained to lead with logic and treat the emotional component as something to be managed or minimized. The training is understandable. It reflects a genuine value, the belief that decisions should be made rationally. What it misses is that rational processing is itself affected by emotional context, that the sequence in which logic and relationship are encountered changes how the logic lands, and that ignoring this doesn't make you more rational. It makes you less effective. Put yourself in a specific memory, a conversation where you had every rational argument, where you were right and could demonstrate it, where the logic was clean and the evidence was solid, and where none of it seemed to matter. The other person wasn't persuaded. They weren't even particularly engaged with your argument. They were operating on a different frequency, responding to something in the room that had nothing to do with the merits of what you were saying. Now ask, what was the emotional context of that conversation? Were they defensive, threatened? Had something happened earlier that had already decided the emotional temperature before you spoke? The answer is almost certainly yes. The argument failed not because it was wrong, but because it landed in the wrong climate. One of the more counterintuitive structural realities in Greene's framework is that creating dependency is more powerful than creating gratitude. Law 11 is explicit. Learn to keep people dependent on you. The surface reading sounds cold. The mechanical reality is that gratitude is a temporary state. It diminishes over time. It's vulnerable to being outweighed by new grievances, and it creates no ongoing structural incentive for someone to maintain their investment in your well-being. Dependency is structural. Someone who needs what you provide has an ongoing reason to keep you close, protect your position, and ensure you remain able to provide what they require. The distinction matters because most people, when thinking about how to build strong professional relationships, think in terms of being likable, generous, pleasant to be around. These are not irrelevant, but they produce relationships sustained by goodwill, and goodwill is not a reliable foundation when the stakes get high or the interests start to diverge. What sustains relationships through genuine pressure is usefulness, not in the transactional sense of doing tasks, but in the deeper sense of being someone whose presence makes the system work better for the people who depend on it. The most powerful version of this isn't dependency created by hoarding information or constructing artificial barriers to what you know. It's dependency created by genuine excellence in something that matters. The person whose judgment is the most reliable in the room, the person whose relationships span the widest network, the person whose historical knowledge of the organization makes them irreplaceable during transitions. These are forms of dependency that don't require manipulation to create. They require focus, patience, and a clear-eyed understanding of what the people around you actually need. The long-term consequence of building relationships on pleasantness rather than usefulness is that they become exactly as strong as the pleasantness holds. When the situation becomes difficult, when your interests diverge from the other person's, when you need someone to advocate for you in a room you can't enter, when you need someone to hold their support during a period when supporting you has a cost, pleasantness doesn't hold. What holds is usefulness, reciprocal obligation, and the clear-eyed recognition that your departure would create a problem. Those things don't feel as warm as a relationship built on genuine affection. But they are far more dependable when the temperature in the room changes. Law 16 instructs. Use absence to increase respect and honor. The mechanism is related to proximity, but operates in the opposite direction. When you're constantly available, constantly present, constantly accessible, you become part of the furniture, something the environment assumes without valuing. Withdrawal creates scarcity. It resets the baseline. The meeting room notices the person who's usually in it when that person isn't. The inbox notices the person who usually replies when that person doesn't. Strategic withdrawal isn't about being difficult or manufacturing drama. It's about understanding that value is partly a function of availability, and that the person who is always there costs nothing to lose. The person who might not be there tomorrow has a price. There's a pattern that runs through all of these observations, and it's worth stating plainly before the chapter closes. Power in human environments doesn't flow toward people who want it most. It flows toward people who understand what others need and position themselves as the reliable source of that need. Every law in Greene's framework, when read through this lens, is a different articulation of the same underlying principle. Know your environment, know its needs, and become structurally necessary to the satisfaction of those needs. This isn't a formula for domination, it's a formula for relevance. The two are often confused. They produce very different kinds of influence and very different kinds of people. Taken together, these patterns, the three currencies, the concealment principle, the architecture of reputation, the role of timing, the gap between stated and actual decision criteria, the politics of need, form an invisible infrastructure that runs through every organized human environment you've ever been in. It was running when you got your first job. It was running in the first meeting you attended. It was running in every negotiation, every evaluation, every conversation where something was decided about your future by people who weren't describing what they were actually doing. The infrastructure is invisible not because it's secret, but because it's assumed. Everyone operating inside it learns it through experience, through pattern recognition, through the accumulated lessons of getting things wrong in specific ways and eventually understanding why. The people who navigate it most effectively aren't usually the ones who read about it. They're the ones whose environments taught it to them early, or who had mentors who named it, or who were paying close enough attention to their own experiences to extract the principles from the pattern before the pattern cost them too much. What this chapter is doing, what this entire narrative is doing, is compressing that education. Not replacing the experiential learning, which is irreplaceable, but giving you the vocabulary and the framework that makes experience more legible when it arrives. You'll still have to navigate the rooms. You'll still make mistakes, some of them expensive. But you'll make them with the lights on. Here is what knowing the architecture doesn't immediately tell you. where you are inside it. You now have a map of how information flows, how reputation functions, how timing works, how dependency shapes relationships, how the gap between stated criteria and actual decision-making operates. What you don't yet know with precision is your current position within those dynamics. How much of the information currency do you hold? How strong is your reputation infrastructure? How close are you to the people whose decisions shape your outcomes? How useful are you to the people who could protect your position when something shifts? Those questions require something different from what this chapter has given you. They require you to stop reading the general architecture and start reading your specific room. Not the abstract dynamics of power, but the particular dynamics of the environment you actually inhabit, with its specific players, its specific history, its specific configuration of what's valued and feared and rewarded and ignored. That reading is the work of the next chapter. Not a map of how power operates everywhere, a mirror that shows you where you stand in the specific version of the court you call your life. And what the mirror reflects in many cases is going to require you to sit with something you didn't fully anticipate. The cost of having seen it clearly. Chapter 3. The cost of clarity. What you can't unsee and what it costs you. You were in the middle of a conversation with someone you've known for years when you noticed it. Not a dramatic revelation, nothing so clean as that. A small shift in how they were presenting information. A particular emphasis on certain facts and a deliberate silence around others. A positioning of their argument that you recognized from somewhere and then recognized from everywhere. You kept talking. You kept nodding. And underneath the conversation, a quieter observation was running. This person is doing something deliberate. And then, worse. This person has probably always been doing something deliberate. And then worst. You've always been on the receiving end of it without knowing. The feeling that followed wasn't anger. Anger would have been simpler. It was something more disorienting. A retroactive rereading of a relationship that had felt like one thing and turned out to have had, all along, another layer running beneath it. Not necessarily a malicious layer, just a strategic one. The person wasn't your enemy. They weren't probably doing anything wrong. They were navigating the relationship the way most people navigate relationships, with their interests in mind alongside yours, not instead of yours, but alongside. You had been doing the same thing. You just hadn't known it. This is the first cost of clarity, not what you find out about other people, what you find out about yourself. There's a particular social texture that comes with understanding how power dynamics operate, and it isn't the texture most people expect. Most people expect to feel more capable, more in control of their outcomes, and those things arrive eventually as the understanding deepens and integrates. But the first experience is different. The first experience is a kind of vertigo, the vertigo of watching familiar things reveal unfamiliar structures. You're in a meeting, and you notice when someone times their support of an idea to coincide with the moment the room is most receptive, rather than the moment they first formed the thought. You're in a conversation and you notice when someone reveals a piece of information at the exact moment it will produce the most effect. You're in a relationship and you notice when someone's warmth appears most visibly in the moments when they need something. These observations aren't paranoia. They're accurate, and accuracy in this domain is its own form of loneliness. The loneliness comes from the asymmetry. You're watching things that the people around you aren't watching. Noticing patterns that they're not noticing, and you can't share those observations without fundamentally changing the nature of the relationship. You can't say to a colleague, "I noticed that you position that idea to benefit from my enthusiasm rather than from the strength of the idea itself," even if it's true, even if they know it's true, even if, on some level, they'd respect you more for seeing it. The social contract of most environments doesn't include room for that kind of meta-observation. The game depends on most people not naming the game. The texture of this loneliness is worth describing precisely because it shapes your behavior in ways you might not notice until someone points them out. You start to say less in certain conversations, not out of strategy, but because the commentary running in your head has become too complex to share without explanation. You start to feel a slight delay between what you observe and how you respond, as if there's a processing step happening that didn't used to be there. You become, in certain rooms, more of a watcher than a participant. This is a transitional state, not a permanent condition, But naming it is the first step toward deciding whether it's serving you or limiting you. There's a difference between cynicism and discernment. Cynicism assumes the worst about people's motivations and filters every interaction through that assumption. Discernment observes the dynamics at work in an interaction without immediately assigning moral weight to them. The cynic sees strategy and concludes, "This person is bad." The discerning person sees strategy and asks, "What is this person trying to get? And is that goal compatible with mine?" Cynicism closes, discernment opens. The danger of a new and incomplete understanding of power is that it produces cynicism masquerading as discernment, a vigilance that looks like clarity but is actually a new form of distortion. The overcorrection trap is one of the most reliable features of the early stage of this kind of learning. You acquire a vocabulary for recognizing certain dynamics, and then you see those dynamics everywhere. Every generous act has a motive. Every compliment is a positioning strategy. Every friendship has a transactional undercurrent. The framework that was supposed to help you see more clearly ends up narrowing what you can see because you're now filtering everything through a single lens that explains too much. Greene himself addresses this, though not directly. The deeper you go into the laws, the more you find that the best practitioners of them aren't the most suspicious people in their environments. They're often the most relaxed, the most genuinely curious about other people, the most able to enjoy an interaction without extracting intelligence from it. The strategic capacity is there when they need it, but it doesn't run as a continuous background process, coloring every experience. The person who is always on guard is exhausted by their own vigilance. The person who has integrated the understanding has something more efficient, a pattern recognition capacity that activates when it's useful and quiets when it isn't. The practitioners whose influence seems effortless, who move through rooms with ease and produce the outcomes they want without visible strain, aren't operating the framework consciously at all times. They've moved through the stage you are in and come out the other side, where the principles have become instinct rather than strategy. What looks like effortlessness from the outside is the product of enormous prior deliberate work. But the work is done. The awareness is integrated. The vigilance has become perception. That's the destination. You're not there yet, and that's fine. The overcorrection also produces a specific kind of failure in relationships. When you assume that every act of generosity is strategy, you stop receiving genuine generosity well. Your response signals distrust where trust was offered. The person who is being genuinely generous now has a reason to be less so. You've introduced the dynamic you were trying to protect against when looking for strategy and created it where it didn't exist. The self-fulfilling prophecy of cynicism operates like this in almost every environment. Treating people as fundamentally strategic gives them a reason to become more so, which confirms the belief. The long-term consequence of the overcorrection is that you become someone who produces the exact dynamics you're trying to navigate around. You started with a legitimate desire to understand how power moves so you could operate with more agency. The overcorrection turns that understanding into a liability. Relationships that could have been genuine become transactional because you treated them as transactional first. Environments that might have been functional become adversarial because your suspicion infected them. The map becomes the territory it was supposed to help you navigate. This is the trap. The exit from it isn't less knowledge. It's more integration of the knowledge you already have. Almost everyone who encounters this kind of framework tries to apply it before they're ready to. This is natural and probably necessary. The gap between understanding a principle and applying it well is never crossed without some failed attempts. But the failure has a specific shape in this domain that's worth understanding, because the shape of the failure tells you something important about what the laws actually require. The most common failure is applying the form of a law without understanding its function. You read that you should always say less than necessary, and so you become quiet in meetings, revealing less, strategically withholding. But the silence you produce isn't the silence of someone who knows more than they're saying. It's the silence of someone trying to look like they know more than they're saying. And the two silences read differently in a room. One generates curiosity, the other generates suspicion. The law is about the effect of mystery, not the performance of it. Performing the form without understanding the function produces an uncanny version of the thing you were aiming for. Something that looks almost right from a distance and wrong up close. The same failure appears with Law 1. You understand that you shouldn't outshine the person above you in a hierarchy. And so you hold back in a meeting where your idea would have been the best one in the room, but you hold back clumsily. In a way that's visible, in a way that reads as hesitation rather than strategic deference. The person above you doesn't experience the protection you were extending. They experience your hesitation as a question mark about your competence. You were trying to apply the law, and you produce the opposite of its intended effect. The law isn't about dimming yourself, it's about directing your light. Those are completely different operations, and the difference only becomes clear through the kind of experience that includes failure. The broader failure this example points to is common enough to name. Confusing the goal of a law with the action prescribed by a shallow reading of it. The goal of Law 1 is to preserve the trust and alliance of the person above you by managing their experience of your capability. 100 different actions could serve that goal depending on the context, the relationship, and the specific sensitivities of the person involved. The shallow reading gives you one action: diminish yourself. The deeper reading gives you a principle that generates the right action for each situation. Shallow readings feel satisfying because they're simple and executable. They're also frequently wrong. Here's the inversion that most people miss in the early stage. The laws aren't instructions for performing power. They are observations about what produces certain effects in human systems. The difference is significant. An instruction tells you what to do. An observation tells you what works and why. When you treat the laws as instructions, you get performance. When you treat them as observations, you get understanding. And understanding is what changes your behavior in a lasting way. Not because you're following a rule, but because you genuinely see why a different behavior produces a different result. The performance can be imitated. The understanding can't. Somewhere inside the early stage of this understanding, almost everyone arrives at a version of the same question. It comes at different times and in different forms, but the core of it is always the same. If I learn to operate this way, am I still me? And underneath that question, a more specific one. Is there a version of me that can navigate these dynamics and still be trustworthy, still be someone I recognize, still be someone I'd want to know? The question is legitimate and deserves more than a reassuring answer, because the honest answer is, it depends on what you mean by you. If you mean the person who didn't know the game was being played, that person is already gone. The understanding you now have can't be unlearned. You can choose not to act on it. You can decide that the implications are too uncomfortable and close the book and stop paying attention. But the pattern recognition that's been activated doesn't switch off. You'll keep seeing the dynamics even if you've decided not to think about them. The innocence that felt like a value was partly a form of ignorance. It wasn't yours to keep. If you mean the person whose values you want to preserve, whose commitments to honesty, to genuine connection, to operating with integrity in relationships that matter, that person doesn't have to be lost, but they have to be chosen. Actively, repeatedly. Against the pull of a framework that, if you let it run unchecked, will start to categorize every relationship in terms of its strategic utility and every interaction in terms of its power dynamics. The framework is a tool. It will use you if you don't use it deliberately. What choosing your values looks like in practice is less dramatic than it sounds. It isn't a single declaration made once and held forever. It's a series of small decisions made in specific moments, whether to share information that would hurt someone unnecessarily, whether to exploit a vulnerability you've identified because you can, or to hold it because you've decided that's not who you are, whether to use a law to get what you want in a way that damages something you value more than the outcome. Each of those decisions is a vote for the kind of person you're becoming. The accumulation of those votes, made over time in real situations with real stakes, is the only place where character actually forms. Law 38 offers a relevant observation here, and it's one that people with strong values tend to find the most uncomfortable. Think as you like, but behave like others. The surface reading is about social conformity as protective camouflage, but the deeper reading is about the cost of constant transparency, of making your inner operating system visible to everyone in your environment. There are rooms where your actual views about how things work would make you a target if openly expressed. The law doesn't ask you to abandon those views. It asks you to be judicious about when and to whom you make them visible. That's not hypocrisy. It's discretion. The two feel similar from the outside. They're entirely different from the inside. Think about the last time you said exactly what you thought in a room that wasn't ready for it. Not an error in content, an error in timing, in audience, in context. You were right. The room confirmed it eventually, but the cost of being right at the wrong moment in the wrong room was real, and it affected something. A relationship, a perception, a position you didn't know you were holding until you felt it shift. What would you have needed to know, in that moment, to have been equally honest but more effective? The answer isn't silence. It's precision. Knowing the difference between the room where your honesty is a gift and the room where it's a liability is the specific kind of intelligence this chapter is about. The asymmetry of awareness creates its own burden. You can see what others are doing in a way they can't see themselves. You can identify the strategic layer of a conversation that the person having it isn't conscious of. You can read the dynamics of a room in ways that give you information the other people in it don't have. This sounds like an advantage, and eventually it is. But in the early stage, it creates a particular relational difficulty. You know things about the people around you that they haven't chosen to reveal. Because their behavior is revealing it without their awareness, Law 33 discover. Each man's thumbscrew describes the practice of finding what people most fear, most desire, and most need, and understanding that knowledge as a form of leverage. The law is among the most ethically charged in the book, and for good reason. The capacity to identify what someone's thumbscrew is, their core vulnerability, the thing they'll do almost anything to protect or acquire, is a capacity that can be used to help people or to exploit them. The same knowledge, deployed with genuine care, makes you someone people feel seen by. Deployed with detachment or self-interest, it makes you someone people can't trust without knowing exactly why. This is the specific ethical edge that the early stage of this understanding brings you to. You can see the thumbscrews. You didn't ask to be able to see them. The seeing itself is morally neutral. What you do with the seeing is where the moral weight lives. And that decision, what to do with the asymmetry of what you now perceive, has to be made in real time, in specific situations, with specific people, without the luxury of abstract deliberation. The framework can't make that decision for you. That's precisely where the framework ends and character begins. There's a difference between using someone's vulnerability and being trustworthy with it. These aren't just ethical categories. They're strategic ones. The person who uses a vulnerability they've identified produces a short-term result and a long-term liability. The other person will eventually feel the use, and what they'll feel is not just offense but a specific alert that someone has been inside a room they didn't invite them into. That alert is very hard to undo. The person who is trustworthy with a vulnerability they've identified produces something different. A relationship in which the other person senses, without being able to articulate why, that they are safe. That sense of safety is one of the most powerful forms of loyalty you can generate. It doesn't come from pulling the thumbscrew. It comes from holding it without using it. There's a question that becomes unavoidable once you've spent enough time with this material. How much of what you did before you understood these dynamics was as pure as you thought it was? This isn't a question designed to produce guilt. It's a genuinely interesting empirical one. Human motivation is layered. Most people aren't aware of all of their motives, most of the time. The desire to help someone is often genuine, and also contains within it a desire to be seen helping. The decision to speak up in a meeting is often about the idea, and also about the desire to be recognized as the person with the idea. The relationship you thought of as purely affectionate has almost certainly contained elements of need, of social benefit, of self-definition. Recognizing the mixed motive isn't the same as concluding that the motivation was corrupt. Mixed motives are the normal condition of human beings operating in complex social environments. The purely altruistic act is probably rarer than most people want to believe. The purely self-interested act is probably rarer too. What's common is the blend, the action that serves multiple purposes simultaneously, some of them conscious and some not, some of them generous and some self-serving. What changes when you understand power dynamics is that you start to see the blend more clearly, in others, and in yourself. And seeing the blend is uncomfortable when you've been telling yourself a simpler story. The discomfort is information. Not evidence of corruption, but evidence of complexity. The person who can hold that complexity, who can recognize that their motivations are mixed without concluding that they're therefore invalid, who can see the strategic layer in a genuine relationship, without concluding that the relationship is therefore fake, is developing something important. Call it psychological realism, the capacity to hold an accurate picture of human motivation, including your own, without either romanticizing it or condemning it. This capacity is rare. It's also one of the prerequisites for using these laws well. The long-term consequence of not developing this capacity is that you keep cycling through the same disillusionment. You believe in the pure version of something, a friendship, an organization, a relationship, until the evidence of its mixed nature becomes undeniable, and then you feel betrayed by the gap between what you believed and what you found. The cycle is painful and repetitive, and the exit from it isn't better people or better organizations. It's a more accurate picture of what people and organizations actually are. That accuracy isn't cynicism. It's the foundation on which genuine trust can be built. Not the trust of someone who hasn't looked, but the trust of someone who looked and chose anyway. There is a specific phase in the process of internalizing any complex understanding of human behavior that feels like being stuck. You've moved past not knowing. You can see the dynamics with some clarity, but you haven't yet developed the judgment, the timing, the relational fluency that would allow you to act on what you see with any confidence that the action will produce the intended effect. You're caught between the old behavior, which was natural but partially blind, and the new behavior, which you can describe but can't yet execute without it feeling false. This phase is uncomfortable, and it's supposed to be. It's the phase where the learning is actually happening. The old pattern has been disrupted, but the new one isn't installed yet. You're operating with incomplete circuitry. Some of what you do will be too cautious. You'll hold back when you should have moved. Some of it will be too calculated. You'll try to execute a law and it will come out stiff, readable, ineffective. Some of it will be retroactively understood. You'll look back on an interaction days later and see what was happening with a clarity you didn't have in the moment. What this phase requires isn't resolution. It requires patience with incompleteness, a willingness to stay in the discomfort of knowing more than you can yet use, without the compensating comfort of either going back to not knowing or rushing forward into a false confidence that you've already integrated what you've learned. The people who move through this phase well are the ones who can hold the tension between what they understand and what they can do, and who use the gap not as evidence of failure, but as the specific territory where real learning lives. Where are you in that gap right now? Not in the abstract, in the specific environment where you spend most of your time. What dynamics can you now see that you couldn't see before this narrative began? And which of those dynamics are you able to respond to deliberately? And which are you still responding to on autopilot, with the old patterns that got you here? The gap between those two categories is the work. Not a problem to be solved and moved past. The actual work that determines what kind of person you're becoming. The chapter you just moved through didn't resolve the tension it opened. That was deliberate. The tension between knowing how power works and being uncertain about who you become in the knowing. Between the clarity of the map and the discomfort of what it shows you about the territory, including the territory of your own motivations. That tension doesn't resolve at this stage. It's not supposed to. Resolution isn't what this chapter offers. What it offers is an honest accounting of what the cost of clarity actually is. The loneliness of seeing what others don't. The failure of the early application. The identity question that can't be answered theoretically. The asymmetry of awareness and what it asks of your character. The mixed motive and what it says about the story you've been telling yourself. These aren't problems to be solved before you continue. They are the conditions of the journey. You carry them forward. The question that sits at the edge of this chapter, the one that won't let you put it down, isn't about the laws. It's about the person applying them. You've been reading a forensic examination of how human beings behave when the stakes are real. The uncomfortable thing about a sufficiently good forensic examination is that eventually it turns the lens on the examiner. What you find there isn't clean. You knew it wouldn't be. What you do with what you find, that's what you wake up tomorrow and have to decide. Chapter 4. The deliberate move. What it looks like when you stop analyzing and start acting. You noticed it on a Tuesday, midway through a conversation that 3 months ago would have gone differently. Someone was pressing you for a position you hadn't fully formed yet, and the old version of you would have given it. Offered something half-considered, committed to it before the thinking was complete, because the silence felt like an admission of uncertainty. This time you didn't. You said less than what you knew. You watched what happened in the space where your usual response would have been. And what happened in that space was that the other person filled it with information you wouldn't have had if you'd spoken first. It wasn't a triumph. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt mostly like noticing. The action had been small. A pause where a sentence usually goes, a question instead of an answer. But the result was different from what your previous behavior would have produced. And the difference had a quality you hadn't expected. It felt like you, more than the version of you that filled every silence on instinct. The deliberate version felt, paradoxically, more authentic than the reactive one. This is where Chapter 4 begins. Not at the grand strategic move, not at the long game maneuver that rearranges the board. At the Tuesday conversation, the ordinary moment, the small deliberate choice that produces a result the unreflective version of you wouldn't have gotten. That's where the laws stop being something you read about and start being something you inhabit. There's a specific moment in the process of internalizing any framework for understanding human behavior where the relationship to the framework changes. Before the moment, you're a student. You read, you observe, you recognize patterns in retrospect, you build the vocabulary. After the moment, you're a practitioner. You act with the framework present, you make choices informed by it in real time. You catch yourself mid-behavior and redirect rather than reviewing the behavior afterward. The moment itself is rarely dramatic. It often happens exactly the way described above, a small choice made deliberately that produces a different result from what habit would have delivered. The transition from analysis to action changes what you need from the framework. When you were a student, what you needed was breadth, exposure to as many of the laws as possible, familiarity with the range of dynamics they described, the ability to recognize them in the environments around you. As a practitioner, what you need is depth in the few laws most relevant to your specific situation and precision in distinguishing which of the available principles applies to the moment you're actually in. The 48 laws aren't 48 things to do simultaneously. They're 48 lenses. A practitioner knows which lens to pick up. The calibration problem, knowing which law applies when, is the core practical challenge of this stage. And it can't be solved by more reading. It can only be resolved through action and feedback, trying something, observing the result, adjusting. The people who get stuck at the analysis stage are usually people who are waiting to feel certain before they act. They're trying to think their way to competence. But competence in social dynamics is like competence in any embodied skill. It lives in the doing, not in the knowing about the doing. You have to get your hands in it. The fastest way to develop calibration is also the most uncomfortable. Act before you're certain. Observe the result with honesty and adjust. Not adjust in the sense of punishing yourself for the miscalibration. Adjust in the sense of updating the model. Every interaction where you applied a principle and got a result is a data point. The practitioner who accumulates data points with genuine curiosity, who treats a miscalibration as information rather than a failure, develops calibration faster than the one who acts only when already confident. Confidence follows competence. Competence follows repetition. Repetition follows action. There's a difference between applying a law correctly and applying the right law. These are two separate errors with separate costs. Applying a law incorrectly means your execution of the principle is poor. Your silence reads as blankness rather than authority. Your strategic retreat looks like confusion rather than positioning. Applying the wrong law means your execution is fine, but the principle doesn't fit the situation. You're deploying mystery in a context that needed directness, maintaining distance in a relationship that needed closeness. The first error produces awkward results. The second produces the opposite of what you wanted, executed with complete competence. Of the two, the second is more dangerous and harder to diagnose. Most people, when they first begin to apply these principles, do so reactively. Something happens, a perceived threat, a position under pressure, a relationship that shifts in a direction they don't want, and they reach for the framework as a response to what's already in motion. This is better than not having the framework at all, but it's a significantly weaker use of it than proactive application. Reactive power is defensive, it manages damage. Proactive power shapes conditions before damage occurs. The distinction matters. because the emotional state of reactive application is different from the emotional state of proactive application, and the emotional state affects the quality of the decision. When you are reacting to something already happening, when you feel threatened, outmaneuvered, or caught off guard, the prefrontal cortex, which handles strategic thinking, is partially compromised by the stress response. You're making decisions in a state that degrades the quality of decisions. You might be applying the laws, but you're applying them with less cognitive bandwidth than the situation requires. Proactive application happens in a different state. You're thinking about the room before you enter it. You're positioning yourself before there's pressure to move. You're building reputation, accumulating information, deepening proximity. Not because you're in a threatening situation right now, but because you understand that situations become threatening without warning. And the people who navigate them best are the ones who were already positioned to do so. The chess player who controls the center of the board before the middle game is applying the same principle. Position matters most when you acquire it, before you need it. The long-term consequence of staying in reactive mode is that you're always behind. You're managing the last problem when the next one is forming. Your energy goes into damage control rather than position building. Over time, this creates a pattern that looks like bad luck from the outside, but is a structural deficit. You haven't built the reserves of reputation, relationship, and information that cushion you when something goes wrong. The person with those reserves absorbs the same event as a speed bump. You absorb it as a crisis. The disciplines that build a proactive orientation are simpler than they sound. Before any significant interaction, spend 2 minutes asking what the other person needs from the encounter. Not what you need from them, but what they need. Before any significant decision, ask what position this decision will put you in 15 moves from now. Not just what it solves immediately. Before any extended period of waiting, identify what you can build in the waiting that you'll be glad you built when the moment arrives. These aren't complex practices. They're redirections of attention from the immediate to the structural. Over time, the structural becomes the natural frame. Law 4. Always say less than necessary is one of the most consistently misread and most consistently useful of Greene's principles. The misreading is that it's advice to be withholding, to hold information back as a display of strategic opacity. The actual principle is simpler and more interesting. When you speak beyond the point of necessity, you give other people information about your thinking, your uncertainties, your positions, and your emotional state that they can use to form responses before you've finished forming your own. Saying less isn't about withholding. It's about not revealing your hand before the round is finished. In practice, this law has an immediate and observable effect in most professional conversations. The person who speaks less in most group settings is attributed more depth than the person who speaks often. This isn't always rational. Frequent speech can contain more substance than infrequent speech, and silence doesn't guarantee depth, but it reflects a real psychological mechanism. We attribute the gap between what someone says and what they know to content we haven't heard yet. We assume the quiet person is quiet for a reason. The assumption is often wrong, but it consistently produces a different reception than the person who says everything they know as soon as they know it. The application of this law requires a specific internal discipline that most people underestimate. The urge to fill silence, to explain your reasoning, to share the full context of your thinking. These are strong, socially conditioned impulses. They come from a legitimate place. Transparency and completeness feel honest, and you were probably raised to value honesty expressed through thoroughness. Restraining those impulses doesn't mean abandoning the value. It means recognizing that in many contexts, full disclosure works against your interest, and sometimes against the interests of the conversation itself. The doctor who explains every possible diagnosis before they've finished gathering information doesn't serve the patient better by doing so. They increase anxiety without increasing clarity. Here's the inversion that makes Law 4 click. The listener completes what you leave unfinished. Whatever you don't say, they fill in with their own assumptions, their own projections, their own version of what a person like you in a situation like this would know or feel. Their completion is almost always more generous than your actual position, because it's filtered through their own needs and through the reputation you've built. The person who has cultivated a reputation for good judgment and then says less than expected gives the listener an opportunity to attribute extraordinary judgment to the silence. The full explanation would have been ordinary. The silence becomes extraordinary, not because of what's there, because of what isn't. The practice of holding silence under social pressure has a specific training protocol. You practice it first in low-stakes situations, conversations where nothing important is at stake, where you can observe the discomfort of the pause without the added anxiety of caring about the outcome. You notice when the urge to speak comes, what triggers it, what it feels like. You hold the pause anyway. You watch what the other person does with it. Over dozens of small practices, the association between silence and threat begins to loosen. The pause stops feeling like exposure and starts feeling like space. That's the transition you're training toward. The most difficult thing about playing a long game is that it requires you to tolerate short-term discomfort for long-term advantage in environments where the pressure to act immediately is constant, and the rewards for immediate action are visible while the rewards for patient positioning are not. Most organizations reward the person who solves the visible problem right now. They don't reward the person who prevented the problem from becoming visible in the first place. Most relationships reward the person who responds to the emotional moment with immediate engagement. They don't reward the person who managed the emotional temperature 3 conversations earlier so the crisis never materialized. This creates a systematic bias against long-game thinking that operates at the institutional level. The short-term player gets recognized. The long-term player gets results. These aren't always the same person, and in environments that mistake recognition for results, the long-term player can find themselves consistently outflanked by people who are considerably noisier about what they're doing. Knowing this is useful not because it tells you to become noisier, but because it tells you to be deliberate about when and how your long-game work becomes visible. The long game doesn't require invisibility. It requires controlled visibility, choosing when to be seen and what to be seen doing. Law 29. Plan all the way to the end is the architectural principle of long-game thinking. What it demands isn't just patience. It demands that you hold the end state clearly in mind while executing the early moves, so that each early move is chosen not just for its immediate effect, but for its contribution to the position you want to occupy 10 moves from now. Most people plan 2 or 3 moves ahead. The person who has internalized Law 29 is planning 15, while remaining flexible enough to adapt when the board changes, which it always does. The plan isn't a script. It's a destination that survives the disruption of the path. Where is your 10-move position right now? Not in the abstract sense of where you want to be in 5 years, but in the concrete sense of what moves you're currently making and what position those moves are building toward. Most people can't answer this precisely. They have goals but not trajectories. They know what they want but not what the sequence of moves that gets them there looks like. The difference between a goal and a trajectory is what converts aspiration into position. Without a trajectory, you're responding to what happens. With one, you're reading what happens for its implications on where you're headed. Law 19. Know who you're dealing with is the law that most consistently separates effective practitioners from ineffective ones. Its premise is that not all people respond to the same approaches, and that applying the wrong strategy to the wrong person produces not just neutral results, but actively bad ones. There are people who respond to reason and people who respond to emotion. There are people who respect directness and people who feel threatened by it. There are people who absorb a loss gracefully and people who convert every loss into a grievance that shapes everything that follows. Knowing which kind of person you're dealing with before you decide how to deal with them is not a refinement of the other laws. It's a prerequisite. Greene identifies several archetypal difficult personalities: the arrogant and proud, the insecure and suspicious, the overly literal, the cold and unfeeling. Each responds differently to the same action. A direct challenge that earns respect from a secure, confident person will feel like an attack to an insecure one and be received as such, regardless of your intention. Generosity that builds goodwill with a straightforward personality will be read as weakness or manipulation by someone whose fundamental orientation is suspicious. The action doesn't carry its meaning from your end. It receives its meaning at the other person's end. And what it means there depends entirely on who they are. The practical implication is that observation precedes action in every high-stakes situation. Before you decide how to engage with someone on something that matters, you need to know something real about how they process information, what they're most sensitive to, what they've done in the past when they felt threatened or respected or generous or cornered. That information comes from watching them in situations that reveal rather than perform. People reveal themselves most clearly when they're responding to something unexpected, when they lose something they wanted, when someone challenges them in public, when they're given an opportunity to be generous at some small cost to themselves. Those moments tell you more about someone than 100 ordinary interactions. Think about someone in your current environment whose behavior you consistently find difficult to predict, not random, but opaque in a way that makes you uncertain how they'll receive things before you send them. Now ask, how much time have you spent observing this person in situations that weren't about you? How much do you actually know about what they're sensitive to, what they're afraid of, what kind of loss activates their most protective responses? The opacity you're experiencing isn't evidence that they're complicated. It's evidence of an information gap on your end. The solution to the opacity is observation, not more attempts to engage on your best guess. Law 25 instructs you to recreate yourself, to not accept the roles and identities that circumstances have assigned you, but to forge a new image that commands attention and reflects who you actually are. On first reading, this sounds like advice to become someone else. A performance, a mask you wear strategically and remove when you're alone. That reading misses what's most useful about the principle. What Greene is describing isn't the construction of a false self. It's the recognition that the self you've been operating as in your professional and social environments has been shaped as much by circumstances as by your own deliberate choices. The role you occupy in your organization isn't just a function of your abilities. It's a function of how you were first perceived when you arrived, what the organization needed from you at that point, how you responded to the early pressures, and the accumulated interpretations that other people built on those early impressions. That version of you, the one your environment has collectively constructed through years of pattern recognition, may be a very imprecise match for what you actually are. Recreating yourself in the practical sense means identifying the gap between the image your environment currently holds and the image that would serve your actual capabilities and goals. Then systematically closing that gap through deliberate action over time, not by announcing the change. Announcements create resistance and invite scrutiny before you've demonstrated the new reality. Through accumulated evidence that makes the new image feel like recognition rather than revision, the people who have shifted how they're perceived in a major way and done it well rarely did it with a dramatic gesture. They did it with a sustained series of moves that gradually made the old image feel outdated. The first moves in a recalibration are the most important and the most delicate. You're introducing evidence into an environment that has a stable model of you, and the environment will initially interpret that evidence through the existing model rather than update the model to fit the new evidence. This is normal and expected. Don't mistake the lag for rejection. The first time you behave differently than expected, people will attribute it to a mood or anomaly. The 5th time, they begin to wonder. The 15th time, the model starts to update. Recalibration is a volume game. The evidence has to accumulate past the threshold of explanation before the reinterpretation happens. There's a difference between reinvention and recalibration. Reinvention is the wholesale replacement of one identity with another. The dramatic change that requires a new environment to take hold because the old environment has too much invested in the previous version. Recalibration is the adjustment of the existing image toward greater accuracy, amplifying aspects of yourself that were present but underweighted, reducing the salience of aspects that were overweighted by circumstances you've moved past. Reinvention is occasionally necessary. Recalibration is almost always available and considerably less costly. Most people who think they need to reinvent themselves actually need to recalibrate, and the difference matters because the strategies are completely different. Here is something nobody tells you about acting from understanding rather than instinct. It's slower. The instinctive response has the speed of habit behind it. The deliberate response has a processing step in the middle that the instinctive response skips. In the early stages of practice, this processing step is noticeable, to you and sometimes to others. You pause where you didn't used to pause. You ask a question where you used to make a statement. You choose to leave a meeting without making your position visible when every previous version of you would have staked a position before leaving. The processing step is uncomfortable, partly because the environment isn't calibrated for it. Most social environments run on implicit timing norms. How long a pause is acceptable before it reads as uncertainty. How quickly a response should come before it reads as disengagement. How much qualification is honest, and how much reads as weakness. When you start operating deliberately, you're running up against those timing norms consciously for the first time. You feel the social pressure to operate at the environment's speed. The discipline is to operate at the situation's speed instead, which is often slower. The discomfort diminishes as the deliberate choices become more fluent. This is the same process that happens in any skill acquisition. The conscious competence phase, where you know what to do but it requires deliberate attention, gradually gives way to unconscious competence, where you do it without thinking about doing it. The goal isn't to remain in the conscious phase forever. The goal is to move through it with enough repetition that the principles become instinct, that the pause before speaking, the question before the statement, the observation before the action become so automatic that you're no longer aware of them as choices. They're just how you are. The long-term consequence of sustained deliberate practice in this domain is a quality that is difficult to describe from the outside, but unmistakable from the inside. The best word for it might be sovereignty, not over other people, but over your own responses. The reactive self is moved by events. Something happens and you respond, and the response is largely determined by the event rather than by you. The deliberate self chooses its responses, not because it's calculating in the moment. The calculation happens early and becomes internalized, but because it has, through practice, expanded the gap between stimulus and response where all genuine choice lives. Viktor Frankl located freedom in that gap. So did the Stoics. Greene approaches it through a more concrete lens, but he arrives at the same territory. That expansion of the gap is what you're building toward, not a version of yourself that is always strategic, always calculating, always performing. A version that has enough internal space to choose how to respond rather than simply reacting to what happens. That space is the specific thing that power, in its deepest sense, produces. Not control over others. Control over yourself, in the presence of others, under conditions that would previously have controlled you. You're not at the end of this. The Tuesday conversation was a beginning, not an arrival. The deliberate pause, the strategic question, the choice to leave a position unannounced. These are single iterations of what becomes, over time, a fundamentally different way of inhabiting every room you enter. The single iteration doesn't feel like transformation. It feels like a choice that went slightly better than usual. But the accumulation of those choices, made repeatedly in the specific rooms of your actual life, with the specific people who populate them, that accumulation is what changes. Not your tactics, not your strategy. The quality of presence you bring to situations where something is actually at stake. And that quality changes how people respond to you, which changes the situations you're in, which changes what choices are available to you, which changes what you become over time. There's one question this chapter hasn't answered, and it's the one you've been carrying since the opening of this narrative, whether understanding how the game is played still allows you to decide what the game is for. Whether the person who emerges from this process, more deliberate, more perceptive, more able to act with intention under pressure, has gained something or traded something for the gain. That question has an answer. But it isn't available yet. It can only be found at the end of the full journey. And the end is one chapter away. Chapter 5. The Sovereign Self. What remains when the game no longer has power over you? There's a quality to rooms that you can only notice after something in you has changed. Not a quality of the room itself, the furniture, the light, the configuration of people around a table. A quality of your attention inside the room. You enter differently. Not because you're performing a different version of yourself, not because you're running a strategic analysis of the space before taking your seat, because the way you see has been reorganized at some level that isn't quite conscious. The room is the same room. You are not quite the same person who used to walk into it. This reorganization is what the previous 4 chapters have been building toward. Not a set of tactics, not a manual. A shift in the quality of perception that, once it takes hold, doesn't ask you to think about it in order to work. You see differently. You hear what's underneath what people say. You notice when someone's behavior is being shaped by a dynamic they haven't named. You sense the architecture of a room before the meeting has started. These aren't skills you activate. They're what it's like to pay a different kind of attention to the world you've always lived in. But there's something else happening in this chapter that isn't captured by the word perception. Something that's been waiting since the hook, since the question planted in the opening of this narrative, the question the laws themselves can't answer, but that the journey through them eventually makes answerable. Whether understanding how the game is played still allows you to decide what the game is for. The person who walked into the first chapter of this narrative had an information gap. They were operating in environments governed by rules they hadn't been taught, producing outcomes they couldn't fully explain, responding to dynamics they could sense but not name. The gap wasn't a character flaw. It was simply the condition of someone who hadn't yet learned the language the world around them was speaking. That gap is now different, not closed, because the gap between what you understand and what you can fluently execute will continue to narrow through experience for years. But different in kind. You can now name what you couldn't name before. You can see the architecture of a situation where before you saw only the surface. You can recognize the dynamics in play in a conversation without waiting until after the conversation to understand what was happening. The pattern recognition is active. The vocabulary is installed. What changes when you can name things is not just your understanding. It's your relationship to your own experience, the events of your life that were opaque before. The situations where you consistently lost without understanding why. The relationships that shifted in ways you couldn't trace. The rooms where you tried hard and came away with less than you should have. Those events now have structure. The structure doesn't make them painless, but it makes them legible. And legibility is the prerequisite for agency. There's a difference between understanding why something happened and being able to change whether it happens again. Understanding comes first. Most people want to skip to agency without going through understanding, and they consequently produce the same outcomes repeatedly, with growing frustration at the gap between effort and result. The path runs in order: legibility, then agency, then the thing that comes after agency, which is what this chapter is actually about. That thing has a simple name, though it arrives as a complex experience: authorship. Not of events. You can't author events, and the attempt to do so is one of the clearest signs that someone has misread what power is for. Authorship of your responses to events. Authorship of the moves you make before events force you to react. Authorship of the relationships you build and the ones you let lapse, the rooms you choose to enter and the ones you walk past, the version of yourself you bring to each encounter, rather than the version the encounter tries to produce. That authorship is what becomes available on the other side of legibility and agency. It is what this chapter is describing. Here is the paradox that every serious reader of Greene eventually arrives at, and that every honest treatment of the laws has to address. The more deeply you understand the laws of power, the more clearly you see that the most powerful people you will ever meet don't appear to be playing for power at all. The person who strikes you as genuinely commanding in a room, whose authority doesn't seem produced by strategy, whose confidence doesn't seem to require validation, whose words carry weight that isn't explained by their position or their argument alone. That person is usually not conscious of executing any of the laws. They've moved past execution into something else. The something else is hard to name without sounding mystical, which would be a disservice to how concrete it actually is. The simplest version: they've internalized the laws so completely that they've moved past them to the thing the laws were always pointing toward. Not the tactics, not the strategies, the orientation. The orientation of someone who understands human nature with enough clarity and accepts it with enough honesty that they no longer need to manage it constantly because they've aligned themselves with it rather than fought it. What does aligning yourself with human nature look like in practice? It looks like being genuinely useful to people rather than strategically useful. It looks like caring what other people need, not as a tactic for making yourself indispensable, but because you've understood, through the study of power, that the world runs on the currency of genuine human need, and that the person who actually meets needs, rather than manages the appearance of meeting them, builds something more durable than any constructed image. It looks like being willing to lose tactical battles because Your sense of what you're building toward is long enough that the tactical loss is incidental. This is also, not coincidentally, what genuine generosity looks like from the inside. Not the managed generosity of someone tracking the ledger of reciprocity, making sure they don't give more than they'll receive. The generosity of someone who understands that the ledger isn't the point, who knows enough about how influence accumulates to trust that genuine investment in other people produces returns that no transactional calculus would have predicted. The laws, read this deeply, don't produce a miser of attention and care. They produce someone who can afford to be generous, precisely because they understand how generosity compounds. The long-term consequence of spending years in sustained study of power dynamics, the consequence that the most sophisticated readers describe in retrospect, is a kind of freedom. Not the freedom of having no constraints. The freedom of understanding your constraints so well that you stop wasting energy fighting the ones that are real, stop being manipulated by the ones that are imagined, and can direct your attention with much greater precision toward the ones that are actually movable. That clarity about what's real, what's imagined, and what's movable is the most underrated product of this kind of education. In Chapter 3, you encountered the question that most people who engage seriously with this material eventually sit with: if I learn to operate this way, am I still me? The chapter left that question open, deliberately, because the question can't be answered from the analysis stage or even the early practice stage. It can only be answered from the other side of a sustained period of deliberate action, where you've had the chance to discover empirically what you will and won't do when the circumstances create the opportunity. Here is the answer, earned through the journey. Understanding power doesn't tell you who to be. It gives you a much clearer picture of who you actually are. When you know the laws and have them available, when you can see the leverage points, identify the vulnerabilities, deploy the strategic silence, manage the reputation, you encounter yourself in a way the uninformed version of you never could, because the uninformed version never had the choice. They didn't know the option was there. The informed version knows and then decides. What you decide repeatedly, under conditions where the alternative is available and visible, is the most accurate portrait of your actual values you'll ever have. Most people discover that they're more principled than they feared and more strategic than they thought. The fear was that the understanding would corrupt them, and it didn't. What it did instead was give their existing values more traction. Values without understanding of the system you're operating in are largely wishes. Values with understanding become navigation. You go where you were always trying to go, but now you know how to move through the terrain. Here's the inversion that tends to arrive quietly, somewhere in the second or third year of living with this material. The laws don't make you more like the people you were afraid of becoming. They make you better at recognizing those people for what they are. The person who is using you, the person who is managing appearances rather than delivering substance, the person whose warmth is deployed most visibly when they need something. You see them clearly now, and the seeing diffuses them. You're no longer the available target, not because you've become harder, because you've become more accurate. The concept of sovereignty appears at the end of every serious engagement with the question of power, in every tradition that has thought carefully about it. Not sovereignty over other people, that's dominance, and dominance is a brittle thing, dependent on the continued compliance of others, constantly requiring maintenance and defense. The sovereignty the laws ultimately point toward is something quieter and more durable, sovereignty over yourself, over your responses, your attention, your sense of what matters. The ability to be in a room without the room determining who you are. What this looks like in practice has certain invariant features. The sovereign person can hear a criticism without becoming immediately defensive or deferential. They can be praised without becoming dependent on the praise. They can disagree without needing the disagreement to resolve in their favor immediately. They can be in a room with someone who has more formal authority without performing their way into that person's approval. They can be in a room with someone who has less without performing their superiority. The thermostat is internal. The room doesn't set it. The thermostat metaphor is worth pressing on because it explains something most people experience as a mystery. Why certain people seem to make every room better without trying to, while others make rooms worse, even when they're trying to improve them. The person whose thermostat is set internally brings a consistent temperature to whatever space they enter. Not the false consistency of someone performing equanimity, but the genuine consistency of someone whose baseline doesn't depend on external conditions. Rooms sense this. People sense this. The social environment reads that internal consistency as safety, as authority, as something worth orienting toward. You can't produce this effect by performing it. You can only have it by actually having it. And you can only have it by going through the process the previous 4 chapters described. This isn't achieved through willpower or the performance of equanimity. It's the natural product of genuinely not needing what the room is offering. And you genuinely stop needing what the room is offering when you understand how the room works well enough to see that what it offers, status, recognition, the feeling of having won the moment, is real but not primary. When you're clear about what's actually primary for you, the room's offerings become resources you can use rather than currencies you must earn. Think about the last time you were in a room and genuinely didn't care what the room thought of you. Not as a performance of not caring, but because you were actually focused on something more important than the room's assessment. What was the quality of your attention? How much more of the room could you see? Because you weren't spending cognitive bandwidth managing your own presentation. That state, genuinely unattached to the room's evaluation while fully present inside it, is what becomes more accessible as this understanding deepens. Not because you care less about outcomes, because you've stopped confusing the room's immediate assessment with the actual outcome. Now the hook can be answered. The question planted in the opening paragraph of this narrative, whether winning, in the way the game is typically played, still means what you thought it did. The answer is no, and yes. And the difference between the two is the entire distance traveled by this narrative. No, in the sense that what you thought winning meant, the promotion, the closed deal, the room that shifts in your direction, the person across the table who leaves with less than they came in with. These things are real, and understanding the laws makes them more available to you, not less. You're better at getting them now. If those outcomes are what you came here for, they're more within reach. The understanding delivers what it promised on that level, yes, in the sense that the deepest thing the journey reveals is that the person who defines winning as the accumulation of those external outcomes is playing a game that has no endpoint that satisfies. The executive who finally gets the position they spent a decade positioning for discovers, often within 6 months, that the position is its own new game, with its own new threats. The person who finally wins the room discovers that the next room is already forming. The game, played for the game's own stakes, is self-perpetuating. There is no finish line. There is only the next move. The philosopher William James described 2 kinds of experience, the once-born and the twice-born. The once-born person moves through life without a significant fracture in their sense of what things mean. The twice-born person has had that fracture, has encountered something that broke the first understanding and required the construction of a second, more complex one. The twice-born life is harder than the once-born life, but it has resources the once-born life doesn't. The person who has gone through this understanding of power is twice born in this sense. The first understanding, that winning is accumulation, that the game's standard stakes are the right stakes, has been broken. The second understanding, earned through the fracture, is more complex and more livable. It is also the only one from which you can make choices that are genuinely yours, because it is the only one built on an accurate picture of what you're choosing between. The people who use these laws most effectively over the long arc of a life. Not the people who use them to accumulate short-term wins, but the people who become genuinely formidable across decades, are almost uniformly people who aren't playing for the game's standard stakes. They're playing for something outside the game. A body of work that matters. A set of relationships that are genuinely mutual. A capacity to affect outcomes that align with something they actually care about, beyond the score. The laws serve all of that. They serve it considerably better than they serve the person who is playing purely to accumulate what the game typically calls winning. The most powerful move available to someone who fully understands the laws of power is, in many situations, the decision not to play for the available stakes. This sounds like naive idealism from the outside. From the inside, it's the opposite of naive. It's the product of a clear-eyed assessment that the available stakes aren't worth the cost of winning them, and that the person whose approval you are competing for isn't the arbiter of what matters most. The person who makes that assessment from ignorance is opting out because they don't understand the game. The person who makes it from understanding is exercising the most sophisticated form of agency the game allows. What stays with you after a sustained engagement with the laws isn't primarily the specific principles. It's a quality of attention, a way of looking at human behavior that sees structure where before you saw randomness, pattern where before you saw personality, the long game where before you only saw the immediate exchange. That quality of attention is permanent. You don't switch it off when you leave the office or close the book. It becomes part of how you move through the world. This permanence has a price, as Chapter 3 noted, and the price is real. You can't unsee what you've learned to see. Some things that were comfortable in their opacity become less comfortable when you understand their structure. Some relationships that felt simple reveal themselves as more complex. Some institutions that felt neutral reveal themselves as active participants in a power dynamic. The price of clarity is that you can't return to the comfortable blur. But the permanence also carries a gift that Chapter 3 couldn't fully deliver because you weren't ready to receive it yet. The gift is this: the person who sees clearly is not more burdened than the person who doesn't. They're less. Because so much of what people carry as emotional weight, the resentment of unfair outcomes, the confusion of unexplained losses, the anxiety of not understanding what's happening around them, is the weight of opacity, not the weight of reality. Reality, seen clearly, is almost always more workable than the murky version the mind generates in the absence of information. There's a difference between seeing people clearly and seeing through them. Seeing clearly means perceiving someone's motivations, fears, and strategies with accuracy, without the distortions of wishful thinking or unexamined cynicism. Seeing through them means reducing the full human being to the pattern you've identified. The first is wisdom. The second is a different kind of blindness, and a more dangerous one, because it wears the costume of insight. The fully educated practitioner of these laws ultimately arrives at the same place that any genuine wisdom tradition arrives at. Human beings are more complicated than any model of them, and the model is always in service of the encounter, never a substitute for it. You started this narrative in a particular kind of room. One where you had the numbers, the argument, the correct answer, and where someone else left with the result you came in to get. The room was a mystery. The outcome was opaque. The mechanism was invisible. That room still exists. You'll walk into versions of it again. The mechanisms won't always operate in your favor, even with the map. People will still outmaneuver you in specific situations. You'll still lose exchanges you should have won. The world doesn't become fair when you understand it. It becomes navigable. And navigable, after opaque, is a transformation of the entire texture of experience. The next time you walk into that room, something will be different. Not only your preparation, though your preparation will be different. Not only your tactics, though your tactics will be different. The thing that will be different is the quality of your presence. You'll be in it with more of yourself available, because less of you will be occupied by the anxiety of not understanding what's happening. The cognitive bandwidth freed by clarity is real, and it goes somewhere. It goes into the quality of your attention, the precision of your responses, the calibration of when to move and when to wait. The long-term consequence of that quality of presence maintained across enough rooms over enough time is a kind of reputation that no law can fully manufacture. The reputation of someone genuinely formidable, not because of what they hold back or what they project, but because of what they actually are. The reputation that other people build for you in conversations you're not part of, not because you've managed their perception, but because their perception is accurate. That is the rare thing. The reputation that's hard to damage because it's built on substance, earned in rooms where you weren't managing anything. You were just there, fully, and it was enough. The same principle operates in close relationships, though the language is different. The person who has internalized this understanding doesn't bring strategic detachment to the people who matter most to them. They bring something better, the capacity to be fully present to another person, without needing the relationship to validate something in them. The partner, the friend, the colleague you actually care about. The quality of attention you can bring to them is higher when it's not filtered through the management of your own presentation. You can see them, not as they appear to you, not as you need them to be, but as they are. That quality of seeing, genuine, undefended, accurate, is one of the rarest things one person can offer another. It becomes more available as the need for external validation decreases, and here is the final thing that the laws honestly followed all the way to their deepest conclusion: deliver. The recognition that the most durable power is the power that doesn't need to announce itself, the power that doesn't require other people to be smaller in order to function, the power that isn't threatened by other people's competence, because it isn't a zero-sum game for the person who has genuinely arrived at it. The laws spend considerable time mapping the strategies of people who play for position, for dominance, for the accumulation of what the game typically calls winning. That understanding is real and useful. But the highest use of that understanding is to know exactly what you're looking at when you see it, and to have already decided with full information what you're playing for instead. The question planted in the opening of this narrative was about winning. Whether understanding how the game is played still allows you to decide what the game is for. The journey through 5 chapters was the only way to arrive at an answer that's actually yours rather than borrowed from someone else's conclusions. Here is what this journey delivers, stated as plainly as it can be. The person who understands the laws of power and uses them to pursue outcomes that other people have defined for them is using a sophisticated instrument to play a trivial game. The person who understands the laws of power and uses that understanding to pursue what actually matters to them, with precision, with patience, with a clear-eyed view of the terrain, is doing something that has no perfect word in English, but that every wisdom tradition in human history has tried to describe. They're living deliberately. You came here because something in the rooms you've been in wasn't adding up. The mechanism was invisible. The outcomes didn't match the effort or the intention behind it. The game was being played and you didn't know the rules. You know the rules now. What you do with that knowledge, which version of yourself you choose to become, which rooms you walk into, which games you decide are worth playing, and which you leave on the table, that has always been yours to decide. The laws just make the decision honest. They take away the excuse of not knowing. The room is waiting. You know how it works. Walk in.